In this lecture, we're going to have a look at our final plot type in Seaborn, which are grid plots. Like matrix plots that we looked at last time, these are helpful for visualizing the relationship between different variables. There are three types of grid plot to be aware of, which are the PairGrid, PairPlot, and FacetGrid. We'll cover all three of these in this lecture, so let's go ahead and get started. For this lecture, we're just going to be using the tips dataset. We've already used this dataset, so I've just gone ahead and loaded it in, as well as imported matplotlib and Seaborn. Let's start by having a look at the first of our three types of grid plot, which will be the PairGrid. A PairGrid can be used to create a grid of subplots for each pairwise relationship in a dataset. To create our PairGrid, we'll go ahead and say sns.pairgrid, and then we can pass in the name of our data frame. So I'll use the tips data frame that we just imported, and then this is a little small here, so I'll just go ahead and change the grid size to make it a little larger. Okay, so basically what this has done is taken each of our numeric columns and then created a subplot for each of the pairwise relationships for these columns. And then with our PairGrid made, we'll need to go ahead and assign the result of this to a variable, which I'll just call tips_grid. We can actually call map on this variable in order to create our plots. If, for instance, we wanted to create a scatter plot for each of our subplots, we'll pass in the plt.scatter function, and then that'll create a scatter plot for each of the subplots in the PairGrid that we've just made. The other arguments that we've already looked at, such as hue, will also work on our PairGrid. And to demonstrate this, I'll change the hue argument for our PairGrid to be the smoker categorical column from our data frame. And then now our data has been visually differentiated and broken down for each category in this column. To add in our legend, I'll just call the add legend method on our grid like so, which will then add in our legend as we can see here. If we only wanted to plot information for specific columns, such as our total bill and size, we could specify this with the x vars and y vars arguments, and these just let us choose the variables that we want to use for our plots. To plot our total bill and size on the x-axis and our tips on the y-axis, we could go ahead and set our x vars to be a list containing these two column names, and then our y vars to just be the tip column. And then when we run this, we'll only get data plotted for these two columns. And this is now a good opportunity to go over pair plots. Pair plots are very similar to pair grids. However, they remove the initial setup needed in order to create a pair grid, which makes them much simpler and easier to make, although they do lack the customization and flexibility available with pair grids. To create a pair plot, we'll call the pair plot function and then pass in the data that we want to plot. When we run this, it'll automatically create a pair plot without us needing to create the grid first. So using a pair plot is much quicker and easier than using a pair grid, but it just doesn't provide the same level of flexibility and customization that we get by creating our own grids. But arguments like hue will still work just fine now. Okay, and let's now move on to the final grid type of this lecture, which will be the facet grid. The facet grid can be used to visualize either the distribution of a variable or the relationship between two variables across multiple subsets of the dataset. So in a simple sense, this just lets us create subplots based on the values of one or more categorical variables. We'll start off by looking at a simple example of a facet grid. I'll start by creating a new variable, which I'll call tips underscore dataset underscore facet, and then this will be equal to sns.facetGrid. For the arguments, there are quite a lot of options here, but we'll start with the data and col arguments. The data will be our tips dataset, and then I'll set our col, which is short for columns, to be the time column. Let's go ahead and run this so that we can see what our output looks like. And this has just created an empty grid with our two subplots, one for each time of day in our columns, which is what we specified with our col argument. We'll then need to map some plots onto this. Our variable that we set for this grid is called tips dataset facet. So I'll type this in, and then we'll say .map in order to call the map method on this. And then inside of here, I'll just pass in plt.scatter to create a scatter plot. Before we can run this, our scatter plot will need two arguments for our x and y axes. So I'll put in the total bill on our x axis and then the tip on our y axis. Okay, nice one. So basically there, we've just mapped a scatter plot to our facet grid, which is currently being separated into columns by the time of day. And then this lets us see the total bill and tip for both our lunch and dinner meals. For our first plot, this showed the total bill on our x-axis and the tip on our y-axis for all of the orders made at lunchtime. So we can clearly see that as the total bill increases, then so does the tip. We can also see from this though, that orders made at dinner time tend to have a higher total bill as well as a higher tip. And also, there's more points here, so you can see that dinner is a busier time of day. We could also change our grid to break things down even further by the rows too. I'll go back to our facet grid, and then I'll add in the rows argument, and then for this, we can just choose another categorical variable, which I'll set to be the smoker column. And then also, while I'm in here, I'll change our scatter plot over to a histogram as well. And this now shows us the distribution by the time, as well as by if that person smokes or not. And if you wanted to, we could even set the hue argument to break this down even further by yet another categorical column. And again, to see our legend for this, we'll just need to call the add legend method on our grid. But there does come a point when there's too much information for people to quickly and easily take in. Okay, so that's it there for our lecture on grid plots in Seaborn. We won't be using these too much throughout the rest of the course. Most of the time, the more standard and common plots such as the bar plot, scatter plot and histogram will be more helpful and valuable to the work that you're doing. Now that we've finished looking at all of the different types of plots available in Seaborn, we'll move on to looking at some of the styling and customization options available for our plots within Seaborn, which is what we'll move on to now in the next lecture. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you there.